Hello there! Welcome to Kaneki Productions. I'm Kwame Nkrumah. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be looking at capitalism and socialism in the third world between 1950 and 2018. Now, I know there's a lot of contention with regard to the term third world. Historically, it meant basically the rest of the world that wasn't part of either the Western Bloc or part of like the Soviet bloc. However, more recently people kind of said the developing world, etc. We know what we're talking about, right? We don't have to have this kind of like semantic kind of debate. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about the third world, right? Even if there's debates about that and there's debates about what countries are still in the third world and blah, blah, blah. The point is, it's basically the non-Western and the non-kind of Eastern world, right? So that's what we're going to be looking at now. So basically what we're going to do is kind of take a step back and we're going to look through a bunch of different countries, and we're going to basically compare how they've done over time, right, based on what policy they've had. Because the thing is, whenever we look at like economics and we look at public policy, there's a tendency for many people to kind of act as if A, there's no other countries in the world, and B, that like we're in like the year zero as such, right? Whereby we kind of forget everything that's happened beforehand, and we kind of forget everything that's happened in other places. So when people, for instance, say what's a better economic system to have here to lift the poor out of poverty, the debate is basically between the debate, as it often is between capitalism and socialism. But what this video is going to look through is basically how credible is socialism when it comes to its claim of helping the poor, right? So if your aim is helping the poor, so last week we spoke about Marxism and stuff, right? So Marxists are like saying, no, it doesn't matter, like there's exploitation, etc., doesn't matter if the poor help. The socialists, by contrast, are at least saying that actually we don't agree with the kind of Marxist presupposition, right? What we're actually focused on is helping the poor, and we're like for doing it in more democratic and more kind of like ways which will actually help them and stuff, right? So if the stated aim of the socialist is to actually help the poor, then it should be clear by the end of this year, right, what system would actually help the poor the best, right? So that's what we're going to look into now. Now, obviously, with the video, we're going to be looking at lots of different countries and comparing them. I obviously don't have the time or the expertise to kind of say every single policy, and obviously policies change over time. So in some like instances, there might be a more capitalist kind of like policy that gets passed, and then like the next day there might be a more socialist policy, etc., etc. But broadly, what we're going to speak about in this video is a kind of a broad tendency. So if there's a more broad tendency towards free markets and free trade, etc., versus more of a tendency towards a kind of like controlled economy, a centralized economy, towards a more socialist economy, right? With like higher levels of tax and higher levels of spending, and trying to like basically keep like foreign companies from like getting involved and stuff. So trying to basically nationalize things, right? So that's what we're going to look into now. So I know it's going to upset many people, but in this video, I know obviously you guys love seeing my face, and some people in the comment section have said like I'm very cute and stuff, which great, thank you, too kind. But the thing is, for most of this video, right, apart from this introduction and the conclusion, it's just going to be me talking. So you're going to be seeing things on screen, and it's not going to be so I know it's going to be hard for you to kind of deal with it. I know that most of the reason why you guys click on is just to see my beautiful face, but rest assured there's plenty of other videos where you can see that. And obviously as well, if you hit the like button and then if you subscribe, then you can see my beautiful face and help this beautiful face to become even prettier in the preceding years, right? Proceeding years, that's what I meant, yeah. Anyway, enough waffling from me, let's get into the video. So if I've done this correctly, what we should be seeing on screen is a bunch of different countries, right? Actually, if I've not done this correctly, then like the whole video is kind of falling apart. But anyway, so with this, we're going to be looking at a really good resource which I've used many times on this channel before, and it's Our World in Data. So Our World in Data looks at many different things, right? Not just on this topic here, yeah, we're looking at GDP per capita. It covers a wide range of different things, so I highly recommend it, right? But here we're looking at GDP per capita between 1950 and 2018. Now, the reason it goes up to 2018, this is the furthest it goes back. So obviously I can go further back in time, all the way to the year 1000, but most of the countries here don't even have data for and stuff, and the predictions of how it got that data is more spurious. we're going from 1950 because A, that's when we have very, very reliable data, and B, it's within kind of the time when a lot of these places get independence, or like a little bit before. So it makes more sense to kind of like start from there as a comparison to what things were like slightly before independence and what things were like slightly after it, right? Now, you'll be pleased to know the video is not going to be us looking at it through this kind of huge lens here. We're going to break it down kind of country by country. So without further ado, we're going to start with Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So in this video, we're going to be comparing similar countries and similar regions, which hopefully, like for the most part, are neighbouring each other. They have economies set up in similar ways. So for instance, I didn't include Nigeria because A, Nigeria is huge, and B, Nigeria has oil. So therefore, like kind of, you know, a lot of the kind of data with that would be skewed. So what we're looking at here, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, right? So famously, you end up having two leaders, right? So one leader from Ghana and one leader from the Cote d'Ivoire. So the leader from Ghana is my namesake, Kwame Nkrumah. So he was a Pan-Africanist, he was a socialist, and he was very close to the Soviet Union and stuff, although he didn't go away to being a communist. But he and the leader of Cote d'Ivoire, who's my pronunciation of French is terrible, so forgive me. It's Wanye, Felix Wanye, whatever. So one time apparently they did like a kind of famous bet whereby they said, right, we'll see what economic system works here, right? So what policies will work, like kind of. So at this time here, you can see that like Ghana, for the most part, is above Cote d'Ivoire. Like it's richer than Cote d'Ivoire on average. And so Ghana gets its independence in 1957. Cote d'Ivoire, I believe, either gets it in 1958 or I believe it gets it in 1960. Don't quote me on that. I can't fully remember. I have on screen now what the actual year was. Forgive me. But what we can see here is that there ends up being a bit of a divergence, right? So Ghana goes down a kind of route where it ends up becoming much poorer than it was before independence, whereas Cote d'Ivoire ends up being much richer than it was after independence. But then as time went on, you can see that, you know, there's again a divergence, and then both countries are now rapidly growing, but Ghana has kind of retaken its position as being richer than Cote d'Ivoire. So what explains this year? That's kind of what we're going to get into for this part of the video, right? So Kwame Nkrumah ruled from 1957 to when he was overthrown in 1966. So during this time, you can see that, yeah, it picks up a little bit, and then it kind of starts to like kind of just like the economy starts to nosedive and stuff, right? And this is because he started to put through a lot of kind of socialistic policies, right? So he nationalized a lot of industries, he ended up having a really huge like civil service, and there's a whole lot of bureaucracy and stuff, and there was a discouragement from like basically like having like businesses and stuff, and a lot of foreign experts and a lot of like foreign, you know, so civil servants, like business people, etc. A lot of these people were kicked out or were encouraged to kind of leave and stuff, yeah, because there was a policy in many of these sub-Saharan African countries after independence, which was the kind of focus on, we need to get our own people in these job roles, right? So we need to, you know, instead of having foreigners, we need to like kind of like build ourselves up, right? Which pretty much no country historically has ever done. There's always been elements to which countries have been influenced by others. Every country needs other countries in order to grow and stuff, right? And it's through that interaction, it's through that free trade and those free exchange of ideas, that's how economies flourish, right? So anyway, so Ghana continues to go down this road, and I can't remember whether it was straight after Nkrumah or a little bit afterwards, but you know, having someone called Rawlins. So Rawlins was, you know, he was leading the country at this point, and in 1983, basically this is when they completely bottom out, and they have to turn to the World Bank, and the World Bank says, okay, we'll give you these loans. However, you're going to need to privatize a bunch of things. You're going to need to, fire a bunch of civil servants. You're going to have to get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy, and you're going to have to open your country up to free trade, right? So, you know, a lot of people domestically would have been like, no, this is bad, and blah, 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 and you're selling off our resources and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff, right? However, the economy of Ghana starts to pick up, and you can see a near continuous growth from that period on, right? So they have stable governments, they have like, you know, stable markets and stuff, like they have proper rule of law once again, right? Well, it's arguable whether they had it under the British, of course, yeah, but the point is that they adopted a kind of a legal system which is similar to many places within like the former British Empire and stuff. So having stable institutions and having a thing where businesses know how like the system operates and stuff. So yes, there's corruption, but by and large, it's a thing where there's less corruption and things are more standardized and there's less government interference. So Ghana now is one of the richest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. On the contrast, right? So Cote d'Ivoire, so the leader there, Wanye, so he didn't get rid of foreigners and stuff. As a matter of fact, by 1980, there were more Westerners in Cote d'Ivoire than there had been in 1960, right? So he allowed people to come in, he allowed private business to come in, etc., right? However, in the 1980s, you can see that it really dipped off. Now, the reason why the economy dipped off is twofold, but obviously there's many things that kind of explain things, right? So first of all, in both of these countries, right, the price of cocoa is very much tied to the national economy because it's one of their greatest exports, right? So cocoa, obviously, that goes into chocolate, etc. So around this time, the price of cocoa really plummeted. So this really hurt the economies of both of these countries. However, at a time when Ghana is kind of picking itself up and trying to recover, Cote d'Ivoire is it's starting to kind of bottom out, right? So Cote d'Ivoire is going from being almost twice as rich as Ghana is, right, to all of a sudden being almost level, right? And this is because around the 1980s, right, you started to see a reversal of these policies, right? So how Wanye ended up responding to the collapse of things, right, is much in the same way as a lot of politicians do, right, in time of crisis. They go, right, we need more government intervention, right? So when there's a financial crash, we need more intervention, we need more of this, more of that, etc. So they end up being a policy of Ivorianization. So they end up trying to hire more Ivorians, get rid of more of these experts. So all of these kind of good policies end up being slowly reversed over time. And so they end up being civil wars and all kinds of chaos and stuff that end up happening during this time. And more recently, Cote d'Ivoire has to stabilize, and that's why it's kind of now catching up again with Ghana. So in 2000 or 2011, you can see that the gap is quite high. Now the gap's kind of closed off. But yeah, so based on this, we can see here's the example of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. In one case, they kind of almost go in opposite directions, right? So at the time when one place is going more along a capitalist route, the other one's going more socialist, and then it kind of diverges, and now both places are kind of going more along a kind of capitalist route and so on. So we've covered that. Now we're going to move on to two other sub-Saharan African countries, right? So we have Botswana and we have Zimbabwe, right? So these countries are neighboring each other. However, we can see that, in the 1950s, Zimbabwe, or as it was known then, South Rhodesia, they were much wealthier than Botswana, right? So you can see that the peak for Zimbabwe was around the early 70s, right? So in 1965, South Rhodesia ended up basically splitting away from the British Empire, and then officially it did so in 1980. And 1980 is when Robert Mugabe ended up overthrowing Ian Smith, right? So Ian Smith was the white guy who was in charge of Zimbabwe. It was basically an apartheid system and stuff. And so there were sanctions and all kinds of things, and ended up being a civil war, which was known as the Bush War during this time. So it kind of hurt the economy of Zimbabwe. Then since Mugabe got in, Robert Mugabe, he was a socialist and he was very close to the Soviet Union and stuff. And as you can see, it kind of just continually went down. In the early to late 2000s, there ended up being a policy whereby, because a lot of the white farmers still owned a lot of the land in Zimbabwe, so they basically ended up being kind of land reclamation kind of thing. So basically, people with the support of the government would kind of go about in mobs and basically, quote unquote, encourage people to kind of basically move out, basically, right, and to hand over the land to the local mobs, right, but with that lack of knowledge, right, with the expertise of those white farmers now going abroad, it meant that the people there weren't able to administer the kind of the agriculture as well as had been before. So Zimbabwe went from a place where food was plentiful and where it was a net exporter of food to being a place where it ended up being a net importer. And around this time as well, you ended up having the famous hyperinflation. This is where things went really crazy. And Zimbabwe today is still really poor. Meanwhile, Botswana, which is next door, started off very poor. But there was a king, well, the former king in Botswana, because it was called Buchanan, or I can't pronounce it, yeah, right. But he was a prince there or king there, right. And anyway, all different kind of complications. He ended up marrying like a white like English person. I believe they made a film about that and stuff. Can't remember the name of the film. But anyway, he ended up returning, and he ended up putting in some free market policies. So again, didn't kick out foreigners. He allowed foreigners to be there. He encouraged foreigners to be there. He kept the civil service low, like, and maintained like free market policies and stuff. Attracted foreign investment into the country. As we can see here, Botswana, steady growth. Rule of law, stable institutions, right? And Botswana today is, look, it's almost 10 times richer than Zimbabwe is, right? They're right next door, and yet one decided to go down the route of basic socialism, and the other one went down the route of basic capitalism, right? So this is, broadly speaking, again, obviously there will be different policies in different places, and then all of these places, if we talk about like inequality, for instance, like I don't have the figures with regard to Botswana and Zimbabwe, but for instance, when we talk back again about Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, so in the 1980s, right, the poorest 20% of like Ivorians, right, they were twice as wealthy as the bottom 20% of Ghanaians, right? So even the poorest people in Cote d'Ivoire were twice as wealthy as the poorest people in Ghana. So while there ended up being a lot of inequality in Cote d'Ivoire, it was a thing where actually, even though the gap between the rich and poor is huge, it still is a thing where the standard of living of the poorest people is higher than it was in a more equal society like Ghana. And this is one of those things, where it's like, there's the question about like inequality like a big thing, or is it not a big thing? And broadly speaking, it's a thing of like, well, it depends what one's focus is, right? If the focus is the well-being of the poorest people within that society, the real question ought to be not what the gap is between the rich and poor within that society. It ought to be, what is the conditions of the poor when compared to poor people in other places, right, in their neighboring places. That should really be what the standard is when it comes to inequality, right? But obviously that's more like difficult to kind of quantify, right? But anyway, so we looked at Botswana and we looked at Zimbabwe. Now we're going to move on to Latin American countries. So we're going to be looking at Argentina and Chile, right? And I don't know why I said Argentina, because for the rest of this video, I'll probably be saying Argentina, because I'll forget to say the Spanish pronunciation. But anyway, sorry. So Argentina, see, I've just done it now. Anyway, Argentina was, richer than Chile. Like kind of historically, Argentina was one of the richest, if not the richest, country in the world, like at the turn of the last century. But they end up basically doing not very good things, right? There end up being lots of instability, as we covered in our video about the Falklands. You end up having Peron, like kind of in like the 50s and stuff. And there's a bit of growth, but a lot of industries being nationalized, end up being very unstable kind of governments and stuff. You end up having lots of different coups. And then around the time when the Falkland War happened, you end up having like hyperinflation. Not very good, like the economy was like just all over the place. And then even afterwards, even after they had like democratization, there ended up being a little bit of growth, and then they end up having to default on their debt repayments, right? And then a little bit of growth, and then there's and then it's kind of so Argentina very unstable with regard to its growth, and so it's, the policies there have been interventionist, perhaps more than one could say that they're necessarily socialist, but still, like, it's a thing of government intervention, right? Meanwhile, Chile, right, was poorer than Argentina, right? But in 1970, I believe this is the first and only time when a country voted for a communist party, right? So then, Salvador Allende, he narrowly won the 1970 Chilean election. So he ended up becoming the president of Chile then. So it goes okay for like a year, and then starts dipping down, right? So he ends up being overthrown in 1973, and this is at a time when they're having lots of hyperinflation, like kind of lots of instability, etc., right? You're starting to see a bit of a pattern, right? But anyway, so Augusto Pinochet ends up taking over, and it ends up being a bit of a dip here, as one sees in many kind of like Western countries during the early to mid 70s, but ends up being some rapid growth. Then ends up being a bit of a crisis here, like because there's been like a global recession in like the 80s, but broadly speaking, like Chile is like really picking up. So at the time when Pinochet is overthrown, they are doing better than they had been like in 1970. And since then, they kind of had stable institutions, a rule of law, democracy. So Chile today is doing much better off than Argentina is, right? So again, it's this same kind of policy of, if the government intervenes in the economy, it's not always for the best. Oftentimes what you just need is stable institutions, and that way businesses like know how to operate and stuff, and therefore like businesses can then they're the real like kind of like drivers of the economy, not the government, right? The next two places we're looking at, again in South America, so we're looking at Venezuela and we're looking at Colombia. Now, Venezuela and Colombia are next to each other. However, it's important to know, as we kind of said with the case of Nigeria, Venezuela is a huge oil producing country, right? So part of the reason why there's this huge gap is mainly to do with the fact of this like oil, right? However, what has Venezuela done with oil, right? This is the kind of like curse that many places with natural resources have found, which is that actually just because you've got natural resources doesn't necessarily mean that everything's all hunky-dory, right? So Venezuela doing very well up until 1977, then unstable governments. I believe in, was it 2001 or was it sometime around like 2000? I think it was 1999, I can't remember now. So Hugo Chavez ends up taking over, and then there have been a bit of instability during this time. But with the high oil prices, Venezuela ends up doing quite well for itself until it gets to this point in 2013, where Maduro ends up kind of taking over. I think he might have taken over the year before or something like that. But he starts enacting really, really harsh kind of like socialistic policies. Starts to really go down like the route of like Cuba and stuff, and basically and he becomes more and more dictatorial, and you end up having hyperinflation to some crazy levels. Now, I've never played a World of Warcraft, but I've been told, or rather I've read, that the currency within World of Warcraft was apparently at one point higher than the Venezuelan currency was, right? So that gives you a bit of an idea of just how devalued it was, right? People were so poor that they had to basically go to the butchers and ask for basically rotten meat, just to be able to survive. That's how kind of bad it it's got in Venezuela. And Venezuela is completely dipped down. So even in spite of its oil, this is from 2018. It's probably a very similar picture now. So Venezuela, which had all this time been much wealthier than Colombia. Colombia during this time, yes, you've had civil wars with like the FARC rebels and stuff, etc., etc. And yes, you've had lots of the drug wars with Pablo Escobar, etc., etc. But still, on the whole, it's had relatively stable institutions, and as a result, Colombia has continually grown over time. Yes, obviously there's inequality everywhere, but if we're just looking at the average person in these places, things have got better steadily over time with regard to Colombia. And with regard to Venezuela, Venezuela hasn't been this poor since like the 1950s pretty much, right? So not very good at all. The next place we're going to look at is Cuba and Dominican Republic, right? So Cuba, much richer than Dominican Republic, and they ended up being the revolution in 1959, where Castro ends up taking over. So as you can see there, at this moment in time, Dominican Republic was much poorer than Cuba. However, you end up having the embargo, you end up having all these kind of things, but the Soviets kind of propped up Cuba and stuff during this time, so the economy didn't just completely tank. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, they end up being the pulling out of all the kind of funds. So Cuba today would probably be maybe here if it continued to go on that kind of thing. However, they end up being a huge kind of dip down, and Cuba's now recovered largely, right? However, a lot of the time here now they've opened themselves up to tourism. They've opened themselves up to foreign trade, and they've opened themselves up to business, and allowing Cubans themselves to basically have their own kind of businesses and stuff now. So you're starting to see people in Cuba becoming rich for the first time, whereas before literally doctors would have to moonlight and as taxi drivers just to be able to get money, because they'd be paid more as taxi drivers than they would as doctors, right? So in the contrast, right, you can see Dominican Republic is it's very poor and lots of kind of unstable things. You've had military dictatorships, etc. But then in 1990s, they end up having some free market policies, some free trade policies, etc. And look, you can see here, boom, taking off, right? So Dominican Republic doing very well for itself, and is now almost almost twice as rich as Cuba, when at the start of this thing here in 1950, it's a thing where Cuba is almost twice as rich as Dominican Republic, right? So, again, you're starting to see a pattern, you're starting to see a thing where countries open up to the free markets, they start to do well, and where they don't do so well, right? The next thing we're going to look at is South Africa and South Korea. So South Korea at the time of the Korean War, or even before that, South Korea had always been quite a poor kind of like country and stuff. So much poorer than many African countries, right? South Africa, in contrast, around this time, this is when you start to have apartheid imposed. And as the decades go on, you have more and more resistance from the other Western countries and having boycotts, etc., etc. These really pick up in the 1980s. We have like the boycott and like the divest from South Africa kind of like movement and stuff, right? And so when apartheid ends up being lifted in 1994, you start to see South Africa starts to pick up, starts to open itself up and stuff, right? But more recently, in the last few years, right, it's kind of leveled off, right? And it's not doing as well as it might have. And that's mainly because they started to put in policies now, which is like, for instance, the Black economic empowerment. So the policy in South Africa now is, that for every one white person that you hire, you have to hire 3 black people, right? So if there's 4 people going for the job, 3 of them have to be black and 1 of them has to be white, right? So lots of people, you think about like Elon Musk, you think about lots of different white South Africans and stuff, right? They've now left to go to England, to go to America, to go to Australia, to go all these different places, right? Because South Africa now is not a great place for white people. They're kind of like in many ways done apartheid in reverse, and they're doing that to kind of reduce the levels of inequality, because obviously there's huge levels of inequality in South Africa. But the thing is, the way to reduce inequality is to make the standard of living for the poorest people higher. It's not by disincentivizing the wealth of the people at the top, right? So yes, they end up, as a legacy of apartheid, end up being a lot of very wealthy white people, but the way to make black people in South Africa richer isn't by taking the wealth from the whites, as happened in Zimbabwe, which we've seen. It's a thing of no, like, let's put things in place so that black people have like as many opportunities as white people, right? Let's get better education, let's get better healthcare, let's get better infrastructure, etc., etc. Let's create these opportunities, so that black people in South Africa can become richer, right? Anyway, so talking about South Africa, that's broadly kind of like the situation with them. However, South Korea, right? So a lot has been made about South Korea in terms of, oh yeah, like the Americans put in a lot of money to kind of stop them from going communist. But it's a thing where you can say that certainly is the case for Japan after the war. Korea got a little bit, but for the most part, its kind of development came more after like the 1980s, right? So they had like military dictator like kind of like throughout most of this era here, but then they ended up having more like, they started moving towards freer markets and like started to moving towards like democratization, and now Korea, through its stable institutions, again, as absolutely astronomical, right? So South Korea now is 3 times richer than South Africa is, whereas at the beginning of this process here in 1950, well, in the beginning of what we're looking at here, you can see that South Africa was 4 times richer than South Korea. So in a very short amount of time, South Korea has gone from being absolutely like poverty, right, to being one of the richest places like in the world, right? Now we're going to go a little bit closer to home, right? So I'm a quarter Bayesian, right? So my grandma's from Barbados, right? So Jamaica and Barbados started off roughly the same kind of position. So Barbados, like historically, has been wealthier than Jamaica, because they had a lot of like white, like English people kind of like living in Barbados. That's why it kind of up until recently had the kind of nickname of Little England, because there was like so many people would go on holiday there, etc. Well, people still do go on holiday there, etc., etc. But it's very tied culturally to England, right? Whereas Jamaica was always a bit more like rebellious and stuff, right? And obviously you can see that with a lot of like the culture and the music and etc., etc. But anyway, so Jamaica ended up getting its independence in 1962, and Barbados ended up getting its independence in 1966, right? So roughly around this time, this is where like Jamaica ended up going through a period of a lot of instability. You know, having lots of different socialist kind of government stuff. Like if you look at like Bob Marley and stuff, right? What he was all involved in is like, pushing for like this like party versus that party, etc., etc. And lots of debates about socialism and all these kind of things there, right? So Jamaica was kind of riddled with a lot of like instability and stuff, right, during this time. And even nowadays, right, Jamaica is doing okay, but it's not doing that much better than it was back in the 70s, which is why there was an opinion poll which was done in 2012, which is 50 years after independence, and it either showed a majority or it showed a large number of Jamaicans who regretted independence. This is one of the things that I said like in our video with regard to talk about Brexit and talking about American independence and Irish independence, right? So the thing is, if you look at independence as just a kind of like a 5-year kind of thing, yeah, right? It's a thing where, even 50 years afterwards, right? There can still be this kind of regret. It can still be this kind of thing of, was it necessarily the right choice? Because you look at the situation here, Jamaica in 2012 was $7,000 roughly, and that's pretty much where it was at the time of like the 1970s, yeah. So it's a thing where actually in all that time they've not actually grown that much. Meanwhile, Barbados in all that time grew like quite significantly. There's obviously a lot of like kind of like relative stagnation with regard to Barbados, but it's a thing where, broadly speaking, like kind of like they had like social democratic parties. So both of the parties there are quite like centrist. They're also quite like left wing, but more kind of along a kind of like Scandinavian model. So not a great thing for like growth, but at the same time, like people are like relatively well off, and like kind of like social services are there for people, etc., etc. So broadly speaking, like you can see that the people in Barbados are much wealthier than the people in Jamaica, right? Whereas when they started off, they were only slightly better off than them, right? So now we're going to go to the final place, which is going to be China, right? And we're going to compare China not to one country in Africa, because obviously China's massive, it's got over 1 billion people. We're going to compare it to sub-Saharan Africa because they're roughly on similar things when it comes to the economy, right? So looking here, China in 1950 was significantly poorer than the average of sub-Saharan African countries, right? So that's something that we really think about, right? So China, for most of like the recent like history, right, has been poorer, even all the way up until the 1980s, right? Poorer than the average sub-Saharan African country, right? By quite a significant margin in some of these cases. So what has basically changed? How comes it's gone from this to being this, right? So again, in the 1980s, China ended up like opening itself up to free markets, and now look at it, almost a steady thing, right? Steady thing. And China today is almost 4 times better off than sub-Saharan Africa. Meanwhile, sub-Saharan Africa, look, if you look here, it's 1970s, right? And you compare it to what they were doing in the 1990s. The average sub-Saharan African country was doing worse off in 1990 than they were in 1970, right? And around like the year 2000, this is when a lot of countries, in the last like 20 years in Africa, you've had to, more free trade, the elimination of different barriers and stuff. You've had a lot of things being basically opened up for people, and like more of an encouragement of like kind of like business friendly environment, and like more stable governance, etc., etc. So Sub-Saharan Africa is growing. It's not growing as quickly as China and other places like how it ought to, yeah. But still, it still is like making some good progress. So now we've covered all these different places, right? I hope that let me know what you think about it, really, yeah. Because I think that it's quite clear from looking at all the data here over such a large expanse of time that, broadly speaking, this seems to be the thing, right? So if you're comparing capitalism to socialism, there's no contest, right? If you're genuinely interested in the well-being of the poor, you need to pick capitalism, right? Now, there's obviously debates with regards to capitalism, like between a more kind of like social democratic kind of system, like how you have in Scandinavia, or a more kind of free market system, as you tend to have in more kind of the English-speaking countries, and also in places like Switzerland and stuff, right? So basically, the debate really ought to be between Switzerland and Sweden, right? It shouldn't really be between capitalism and socialism, because if what you're saying is that you actually care about the poor, then capitalist policies are the way to lift up the poorest people, right? To lift up the middle classes, right? That's the real thing, yeah. That's the real kind of like lesson to kind of take from this, right? And let me know in the comment section what you think about this, yeah. Does this model necessarily apply for developed countries, or does it only apply for the developing countries? So with all that being said, I hope that you really enjoyed that video. I'm sorry that you can't see more of my beautiful face, of course, but you know, it is what it is. And yeah, the next video is going to be on the history of Ukraine, right? So we're going to be covering a vast amount of the history of that, and basically we're going to be explaining why some regions of Ukraine are very hostile to the Russians and some regions are very pro-Russian, and also again, like vice versa, in terms of why some places are more pro-Western and some places are more pro-Eastern, right? So definitely stay tuned for that, and obviously, like I said, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Stay tuned for all of our great videos. But in the meantime, have a great day and bye.